Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today I wanted to have a conversation around second editions, reprints, update packs, all that kind of thing. And this is a conversation I've had a few times now. In fact, I think this is the third video I've done on the subject, at least the third. I know of at least two others, maybe more, I don't know. This is one of those conversations that I think will come up from time to time. There's certain topics that are always worth repeating, re-engaging, especially because people who may be seeing this video may not have ever seen the previous ones, and they're ongoing conversations in the board game space. I'll post links to those two videos down below. You can check them out. The first one in particular is one of the first videos I ever did on the channel, and I definitely a callback to a time that I spoke much, much slower. I don't know why it is, but as time has gone on YouTube, I've talked quicker, not slower. By default, I talk quickly. I don't know what changed. Anyways, with that said, let's go ahead and dive into this. This is a conversation around second editions, reprints, update packs, all that kind of thing. The nature of the game, the conversation, the complaint that goes on is the fact that people buy a game, they back a game, it shows up at their door, and before you know it, there's a second edition out. There's a new version, a new printing, a third iteration, a 17th iteration. There's an upgrade pack, and the problem is the upgrade pack's going to cost you $40, and you just bought the game. You're being penalized for backing the game first. You're being penalized for somebody who jumped in the first time round. This is a conversation that is always ongoing. The last time I had this conversation, I believe I talked about Machina Arcana was in the middle of a third printing. We had Wild Ascent was having a second printing. We had Nemesis going from Nemesis Regular to Nemesis Lockdown. There are all these games. Chronicles of Dringar was at the time, again having a second printing. And very often with second printings come update packs, enhancements. Either the product is better and you should have waited for that product, or alternatively it's the same product but tweaked, and now the people who back it the second time are getting those tweaks or changes to it. Machina Arcana in particular, they made a first edition, then a second edition, then a third printing version with some degrees of upgrade packs between them. But again, you potentially lost out by being a first backer or had to pay for those. This is a conversation that's been with oh my gosh, what was it even called? Barbarians the Invasion, I think, was one of the games I talked about in my very first video, the things that inspired me to do this conversation the very first time I dove into YouTube. In this particular video or instance, the things that are inspiring me are anything from Gloomhaven second edition. Gloomhaven has a second edition that came out, or is coming out, and there's a lot of pushback against that second edition. You're making my first edition invalid. You're taking away from the product that I bought from you is now worth less because it's inferior. I just bought that and now I have to go ahead and buy a second one, and that's just not cool. We have Tenaris Adventures currently on Kickstarter. They have another upgrade pack. They had Arena of the Contest, then they had Tenaris Adventures, which is kind of a new game with some small upgrades or tweaks or whatnot, new miniatures, things like that. But then we also had, on top of that, we now have Tenaris Adventures Ultimate Edition, giving you more changes to the Tenaris Adventures. People who waited 2 years or more than 2 years to get their hands on Tenaris Adventures, it lands, and then 2 months later, they're like, hey, by the way, we have a new Kickstarter, and things are being tweaked and updated. The best version of the game is not the one that you waited 2 years for, it's the next one coming. And then again, that's frustrating. We have Marvel United, who's had Marvel United. We've had Marvel United the next one. We had Multiverse, constantly iterating and adding new additions, new versions to their product. Monster Hunter World dropped, and then before you knew it, we had Monster Hunter World Iceborne, which is basically Monster Hunter World, but like, hey, we also did like 4 or 5 things that make the product better. We have sculpted bases, that's just cooler. We added a Clutch Claw, which is, that's fun to have. We added monsters invading other monsters. That's just, that's just a good time. These are all things that just make the Monster Hunter experience a better experience. Santorini, 6 years later, dropped Santorini Pantheon, a new edition of the game that kind of invalidates your previous edition. You could kind of get some sort of upgrade pack, if I recall correctly, but it didn't fully cover everything, so you were missing out in some way. And so you can go ahead, and if you were someone who backed Santorini, you were almost penalized for being that first backer the first time round. We have Everdell Farshore that just came out. Everdell just got tweaks to the Everdell formula, small changes to them. And on a personal opinion note, I think that I like Everdell Farshore. I think it's good, but would I recommend it over Everdell? I don't think so. Am I happy I own it? Yes. Am I happy I got sent a review copy so I don't have to decide whether to spend $75 on it? 100% yes. I don't think this game has enough changes to be worth $75. I think it might be a good starting point, but if you're already an Everdell fan, I don't know if it justifies its existence unless you're a full-on completionist. But again, same idea, the tweaks, the changes, and then of course we now have Nemesis again with Nemesis Retaliation coming out as well. Is it Retaliation? We have Lockdown. I think Nemesis Retaliation is the next one, but that's coming out again and adding to the conversation. Again, the conversation comes down to the idea that you're putting out a new product. Whether it's an update pack, whether it's a new product, whether it's a improved version of the game, it can be frustrating to be someone who jumped in on the game the first time round and now feels like you have to pay more or you could have just stepped in at this point in time and not paid more. You're being punished for being an early adopter. That's always the conversation this is going to be. The next time I have it, a year and a half, 2 years from now, when I have this conversation again because of new reprints and expansions, it's going to again be a conversation. It always will be. But the first thing I want to dive into is, why is it even a conversation? And every other market, this isn't a conversation. Phones come out with a new edition every single year. Battlefield, Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, they all come out with new editions every year or every other year. Cars come out with new models, and nobody expects there to be an updated version to their Civic. Ooh, I got the Civic 2020, and they came out with the Civic 2022. I should get one for free. Nobody expects that in any way, shape, or form. Phones, video games, I covered video games, cars, I covered cars, technology, other thing, I don't know. I'd have to think of more things, more categories. But nobody expects a new version of the thing they had in other industries. Nobody expects them to stop making a new version in other industries. Nobody expects them to be tweaking or changing. Hey, I got Call of Duty 4. Well, you should give me Call of Duty 5 for free. Nobody expects that. I think it's a different conversation in board games than video games. And I think any other genre. And I think there's two different factors to that. The first is that to a certain extent, we should acknowledge that in other industries, this expectation that you either shouldn't innovate or should give me the thing for free just doesn't exist. The second is, I'm curious why. Why is that expectation there? This is something I don't think I've talked about in previous videos on the subject. Some of the points I'm touching upon will have been talked about in the past, but this particular point I don't think I've covered in the past, which is, whenever this conversation comes up, you'll get pushback from people giving those examples of, phones, cars, video games, etc., are different, and you do not, your KitchenAid, when you come out with a new KitchenAid model, nobody thinks their old KitchenAid model gets updated, and nobody expects them to stop making it. And there's that slight frustration. You go on Amazon, you buy a KitchenAid, and a new KitchenAid comes out, 2 months later. Maybe it's a frustration, maybe not. And I think board games are different for a variety of reasons. The first reason is going to be the familiarity with the product. This is something that's always a conversation in the YouTube space in general, or any space, which is, there's different kinds of audiences to every single product, to every single thing. There's the passionate hardcore fan base, with most of you watching a video of some random person talking on YouTube about second editions about board games. You're almost certainly into that genre to begin with. You're almost certainly the passionate consumer as opposed to the peripheral consumer. You may have bought a toaster last week and they come out with a new version of the toaster. You don't even know or care. Why in the world would you? But somebody who cares about that market might. And so they may be people who are frustrated about video games, about cars, about phones. There may be. I don't think there are for a variety of other reasons. But the first baseline is, it depends what you're passionate about to begin with. Because whatever version of a game you have, I'll pick one of those. We said Monster Hunter World. If you bought Monster Hunter World in a board game store, you walked in, you bought it, you walked out, you may never know or care about Iceborne. And if you hear about it, you're like, oh, there's more content for the game. I think this problem is more of a problem when you are someone who's buying hundreds and hundreds of games, or not necessarily hundreds, dozens of games every single year. If you're spending hundreds of dollars a year, if not thousands of dollars a year on board games, I think you are a different audience than the person who peripherally finds out that one game they bought happens to have been updated. You're looking at the constant pressure to update everything, to be on top of everything, to stay on top of everything. I think the very first difference is that there's a difference between being the passionate consumer of a product versus the peripheral consumer of a product. And I think the passionate consumer is going to be hit with this problem harder because it's happening to more, and they're more aware of it to begin with. The second problem is the very communal sense of board games. My toaster isn't being shared on 14 Facebook groups, and I'm not inviting 3 people over to try my toaster. My board game is. Board games are shared, both in the sense that I share mine with yours, but also in the sense that I see the pictures of the game you just picked up. When Gloomhaven 2nd Edition lands on people's tables, I guarantee you there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of Facebook posts, and Facebook and Reddit and Board Game Geek. There's going to be posts all over of people experiencing and enjoying that new thing. That you feel like your old thing is not as good because the new thing is being shoved in your face. There's a communal sense. And also, if you're running a game group, people are going to want to spend time with John, who has the new thing, as opposed to you, who has the old thing. That's not in the sense that you're going to be left out of any friendship and all that, but there is that sense of having the newest, greatest thing. Going back to video games, to a certain extent, there's nothing wrong with your PS4, but people are going to prefer a PS5 over a PS4 because of that conversation. There is that sense of community that makes the lack more present, both, in terms of seeing others and in terms of what others experience from you. There's also the nature of crowdfunding, which I think is one of the bigger reasons why it's different. The timeline of crowdfunding adds to this problem so extensively. The timeline of crowdfunding makes it so that when I buy a phone, if I buy a phone today, I don't even know what they're up to. I know Pixels. Pixels are up to what, 7, I think? I think I have a Pixel 7. If I buy a Pixel 7 today, it comes out, I buy it, it shows up next week. It might be 2 years before the Pixel 8 comes out, and I've been able to experience and enjoy my Pixel 7, well, maybe even a year. Let's call it a year. I don't even know what the timeline of these things is. Let's pretend it's a year. A year later, the Pixel 8 comes out, but I've been able to experience and enjoy my Pixel 7 that entire time. I've been using it that entire time, I've enjoyed it that entire time, and a year has gone by in which the Pixel 8 did not exist. The timeline of crowdfunding changes that conversation. Because I buy the Pixel 7 today, a year from now the Pixel 7 shows up, and then 3 weeks later, the announcement of the Pixel 8 is there, and now I have to buy it. Which means I only get to experience and enjoy my Pixel 7 for a few weeks or months before it's already time to buy the Pixel 8. And granted, the Pixel 8 will only actually show up on my doorstep a year from now, so the timeline in theory is still the same branched out difference. But the fact that you are a consumer a year before you get the product, if not more than that, means that pain, that sense of disconnect of I finally got the thing I paid for, and now I get to experience it for a short time before having to buy the new thing, even though technically speaking, you still have the gaps because the new thing is also going to be later. It changes the perception of the problem. You don't get to experience that product for a year uninterrupted. You get to experience it for a few months before you see the egregiousness of seeing an update kit on Kickstarter, before seeing a second edition or third edition or whatever it is edition on Kickstarter. So that timeline of crowdfunding makes the problem so much worse. And then the last reason, and this reason is sad but unfortunate, is the nature of board games. And the fact that they don't always get played changes the conversation again. Board games are bought very often. Again, if you're someone watching this video, you fall into that category of the passionate, almost certainly, the passionate consumer of the hobby. And that means that if you fall into that category, there's a decent chance you also have a large rotation of games that either aren't played or aren't played enough. When you have your Pixel 7, you've used that thing every single day for the entire year. The Pixel 8 comes along, and you either get it or you don't, but you've experienced and enjoyed your product for the entire year. In board games, it's not always so simple. Sometimes you buy that game, and it shows up, and it sits on your shelf with a single play under its belt for the entire year. In some cases, it shows up with no plays under its belt for the entire year. And that means that when the new product comes out, you can't even mentally think to yourself how much you've enjoyed and benefited from the last one. To a certain extent, you are reasonably focused on the fact that you have to buy something now. You don't have to. In fact, you're being presented with the purchase decision, and you haven't even used the thing you got. There's no mental write-off of I paid X, but at least I used it for this amount of time or benefit, all that. It's I paid X, and now they want the new one. And that's not the company's fault, but it just makes the problem more frustrating on the consumer side. And I think that's another reason why we see that hurt. Because you have to buy the new thing. If you only played the old thing 4 times, it feels like that sense of, I paid like $200 for you. I've played you 4 times. What's happening here? And there's a sense of frustration at the company for having that second edition, for having that update, that reprint pack, the thing that makes you feel like you're missing out when you barely got to experience and enjoy the thing the first time around. I'll say a fifth factor is the non-technology nature of board games does mean that many other areas there's kind of an expectation. When it comes to phones, when it comes to cars, when it comes to video games, there's almost an expectation that a new version will come out because technology is constantly keeping up with technology. Versus with board games, that sense isn't there as much. And so it can feel a little bit more frustrating to have a board game that, because with my phone, my Pixel 7 is only going to last a certain number of years before it's outdated anyways. And so yes, it might last 4 years, 5 years, maybe 6 years, whatever it is. Maybe it only lasts 1 year, 2 years. It's going to be, at a certain point, it's going to be outdated by other equivalent technology. And so there's almost that expectation that at a certain point, you'll have to update it anyways. With board games, you can have amazing board games that stand the test of time for a long, long, long time. And so there's a little bit more frustration when they are being replaced or updated in different ways. Even if it is an improvement to the product, there's still that sense of frustration. So congratulations. We talked about why it sometimes feels different with board games versus with other sectors it doesn't. That's not really the point of this video. which is on brand for me. What is it, 10, 15 minutes into this video, and we haven't really hit the point. The problem always is, and the reason this conversation will keep happening, is that the very nature of this disconnect between the publisher putting out a new version of a game, or tweaking the game, or improving the game, as long as the consumer is frustrated by that, it creates a continuous disincentive on creators to improve their product. If you know that when you improve your product, when you put out a second edition, when you put out an upgrade kit, when you tweak that rulebook, if you know that when you do those things, you are going to have hundreds, if not thousands of people who expect that thing for free or at some incredibly discounted rate, you're basically looking at a situation in which the creator is not incentivized to improve the product. Because when you improve the product, people are going to be upset. Because you have people who bought into the product, or people who didn't play the product, and people who now feel like they are owed something along the way. Sometimes it might be easier to simply not create the improvement, the upgrade kit, to all that stuff. Because if you do so, the creation of it makes your product better, but at a cost to the creator because of the expectation of, well, now you owe it to everyone who supported you the first time around. And so how do we resolve that? I don't have perfect answers. I don't in general. I just have minor suggestions as far as things to be mindful of. The first two are going to be kind of on the creator, and the second two are on you, on the consumer. On the creator side, the first thing that I'm generally a fan of when possible, and it's not always possible, is I am a fan of releasing update packs at cost to your previous backers. Not for free. I would never expect a creator to give an update pack for free unless it's, if it's a mistake. If it's like a straight up mistake, they butcher something and they need to release update packs in some sense, sure. But if they're releasing an improvement to their product years later or a year later, whatever it is, I don't expect a creator to do it for free. Because if I expect them to do it for free, it creates a disincentive to improve their product and to keep it up to par. And so, I think releasing update packs at cost to your previous backers is always a good thing to do. I don't think it's essential. I think it is a good thing to do. And understand that sometimes cost is more than you think. Replacing a board, replacing a box, replacing a few giant books of whatever is sometimes more money than you think it is. So at cost may seem like, oh, well, at cost is like $5. Not necessarily. At cost might be $25. But it's still my expectation, not my expectation, my suggestion would be releasing update packs at cost whenever relevant. The second one, which is not always doable for a reason we've talked about in the past, is staggering releases. This doesn't solve the problem, not by a long shot, but it certainly makes the problem more palatable. In general, there's less outrage and frustration with things like Nemesis. There is less. Even Gloomhaven, there's less outrage and frustration on Gloomhaven because these are products that have existed for a long time, and they get update packs at a certain point in time versus continuous, the biggest sense of frustration usually happens when the game just delivered, and then people are immediately expected to decide whether they want to pay for an upgrade pack or a second edition of the game. Even in the case of Gloomhaven, the biggest frustration was not around people who backed or bought the game 6 years ago. It's against people who backed or bought the game in the most recent Frosthaven campaign. It only just showed up, and now within a matter of a few months, they're being asked to decide whether they want the second edition again. Meaning it's recency. The recency of when a game delivers to when you have to make a decision around purchasing an upgrade pack or buying a second edition, that recency is a factor. And so I think staggering releases does help. Meaning if you're a publisher, don't put out that update pack or thing right now. Let the game sit for a year, then put it out. Have the games alternating. Your own product life cycles, have them alternating as much as possible. Again, with Nemesis, you have Awakened Realms putting out constant products, and then Nemesis sneaks in for a reprint every, X number of products. It's one of the most popular games. It makes sense that they're going to tweak it, to update, to add new versions of the game, to give people a new opportunity to get in on them. That all makes sense. But they stagger it so the frustration is less present. The main problem with this is that very often the point at which you can get the most buzz as a creator is your game lands, it shows up people's doorsteps, and now suddenly pictures are going left, right, and center on every single degree of social media, and all the people who didn't get the game are excited, and they're like, well, how can I get my hands on the game? And you can't. The point in which the point to strike at which the iron is hot or whatever it is, that point is when a game lands. And so there is a degree of trade-off. If you don't put out your second edition right away, there is a degree of loss because you are running the risk that the buzz goes away and people aren't nearly as excited a year later because they're not seeing that social media. That is a cost on suggestion number 2. I still am making suggestion number 2. I still think it'll help with the frustration around second editions and upgrade kits and all that stuff, but there certainly is a cost when a creator does that. The other two are on you. The other two are where you get to take agency into your own hands if this is something that's frustrated you. And they're basically decisions. They're decisions that you have to make as a consumer, and they're two different but similar decisions. The first decision is a carte blanche. Don't back things first if you don't want to be an early adopter. It's that simple. When you back something, you are inherently trading off that you are an early adopter. And sometimes that comes with a benefit. Isopher Guard, the early adopters paid $79 for a game that's going to be nearly twice that price now. Sometimes there are benefits to being an early adopter. You get something at a price that is not reasonable. Frosthaven, people who backed Frosthaven got it at a significantly lower price than the nearly doubled MSRP of the game. Sometimes there are benefits to being an early adopter. And other times there's pain. Other times there's costs. Other times there's frustrations. And so don't back games first if you don't want to be an early adopter with all the things that come with that. Potentially better price, potentially worse price. Potentially an amazing game that goes out of print, you can never get your hands on it. Potentially a game that will be tweaked and adjusted and other people will be able to get the improved version of the game down the road. There are pros and cons to being an early adopter, and the key thing is there's pros and cons. You can't just sign up for the pros and not expect the cons to be there. They are part and parcel. And the sad part is if you're not backing that many things, you may back two things and both of them might be cons. They may be full of issues. The more you back, the more you distribute that risk and benefit of how often you'll benefit from being an early adopter versus from how often you'll be punished. But ultimately, don't back games unless you're comfortable being an early adopter. And then the last thing, which is very similar, is don't back things. And this has a little more control, a little more agency, is don't back things if you're not playing them right away. I think a big part of the frustration comes from the fact that you haven't been able to experience that thing nearly as much before you're asked to buy more into it. If you have Gloomhaven, it's been sitting on your shelf for 3 years, and you find out about the second edition, you haven't played it the entire time, that is so much more frustrating than the person who has played through, 40 hours of Gloomhaven. It's going to be more frustrating to you if you have not been able to benefit from the thing you bought the first time round, and you're being asked to pay for it again now. And so try to back fewer things, or be more selective with what you're backing to the point that you're actually experiencing and enjoying the things you bought. Or alternatively, that you're comfortable with the second edition being out. If you are a collector, if you like having a basement full, I always say basement because for me it's basement. If you like having a game room, if you like having shelves full of board games, there's a decent chance that some of those will be replaced. Some of those will be updated. I went out of my way to hunt down the international versions of the Quest for El Dorado, paying a huge premium to get the better versions, the Vincent to Trade artwork of Quest for El Dorado. And then 3 months later, they're like, we're printing them in English, by the way. So I paid for those games the first time. Then I got the updated version artwork from elsewhere. And then it became cheaper as well. So there's costs to being as involved in the hobby as many of us are. And you have to either be okay with that or be more selective about how many things are sitting on your shelf unplayed at any given time. The more games you have, the more of a chance that you're being hit with that next update announcement, that it's affecting you as opposed to someone else. If you have 20 games, you're not going to be hit with that often. If you have 400 games and you're only playing 40 of them a year, there's going to be a cost to keeping everything running, even if you're not playing them. And so that's the conversation. Again, for the third time. I'm sure we'll have it again in the future with whatever new thoughts I have to add at the time, with around whatever new campaign is going to be present. It is an ongoing problem. The nature of the space means people want to improve and update their games, and I'm a fan of that. I'm a fan of the fact that Machina Arcana was continuously tweaked and adjusted to be the best version of itself. I'm a fan of the fact that Tenaris Adventures took all the feedback that people gave when the game arrived, and they said, let's immediately make it better. I am a fan of that. But there are costs along the way. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.